All right, so good morning and welcome to project selection and the project plan. This is the topic we're doing today. And when we're talking about the project selection and the project plan, really, we need to understand in project selection, we have to have an understanding of what the project entails. And this is by understanding three things: your scope, your cost, and your time is understanding. When we speak about the scope, we're talking about the work that has to be done, the work that has to be done in the project and meeting the objectives of this. We talk about the cost, which is the cost goal, which would be ensuring that we stay on budget and within the budget. And then the time goal would be always to stay within the schedule that you would have created with your team. The thing is, and I'm sure you will know, is that this doesn't always happen. Many times you're trying to keep the scope, but the cost going up and the time going up. You're trying to keep the scope, the cost going up, although you're on schedule. You're keeping the scope, but the cost is, you're keeping the cost down, but you're over the schedule, right? So these three always competing with each other, right? It's like if you were to give an example of the children, trying to compete with each other, and you always have to try and manage these three competing goals. But as a project manager, you have to be able to juggle them equally, because by managing the three of them, you are able to manage your project successfully. So like we said, managing your scope, your time, your cost, and you as a project manager, you would have to often balance these three. However, this triple constraint that we talk about eventually evolved over time into what is known as today as the quadruple constraint, whereby quality is now included in that diagram. Because, in construction especially, you're trying to get the work done within the budget, within the schedule, and sometimes there's the possibility that the quality of the work might get left behind. And this is the reality that we are faced with as a project manager. And it was the last thing that we spoke about last week with dealing with integrity. Are you, as a project manager, are you going to allow the quality of your project to be compromised, right? And many times the quality of your project is what determines if you would continue receiving other jobs and other projects to do. So this is why the quality of project is important. So this is why PMI saw it fit to include the quality as a part of the triple constraint, which eventually evolved into the quadruple constraint. So it's quality, scope, time, and cost. Now, within project management, if you were to continue studying project management, you would eventually come across what is known as the project management framework, whereby there are 10 knowledge areas within project management. And these 10 knowledge areas within project management encompass everything that is needed to be understood within project management and all the documentation that is needed. So this is part of the tools and techniques of project management. So I think it was in 2013, there were 9 knowledge areas. And quite often I say, I wonder if persons could understand which was the newest knowledge area to be added, because when we look at them, integration, scope, time, cost, quality, human resources, communication, risk, procurement, and stakeholders, at present, we all know the importance of each knowledge area. right? And, somebody might say integration, but remember, integration is the overall knowledge area, integrating all the processes, and it covers from the initiation of your project to the closing of your project, right? So obviously that would have been there a long time, right? And when you look at the other 9, you're thinking, if that was there since, the framework was developed, which one could it be, right? Because like I said, how could you do a project without thinking about the scope? How could you do a project without understanding your stakeholders or the communication or the risks involved, right? However, in 2013, I believe, or 2014, somewhere about there, the 10th knowledge area was added in, which would be, drumroll, stakeholders. Stakeholders is the newest aspect of the project management, the newest knowledge area that was added into the framework of project management. And it is because that PMI saw the need, or they saw that stakeholders, they play such an integral role in a project whereby a stakeholder could either make or break your project. They could stop projects as well, So this is why stakeholders and understanding stakeholder management is important when you are, undertaking any project. So in undertaking any project and in project selection, one aspect I'd look at is a SWOT analysis. A SWOT analysis, the acronym SWOT, stands for strength, your strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats that you might incur. And we're talking about the strengths your organization would have, your business would have, or the strengths of the project that is going on. And a SWOT analysis doesn't have to only take place at the beginning of a project. A SWOT analysis could also take place anywhere in between the project. And this is what is important to understand. So when we're talking about the strengths and the weaknesses, we really talk about the internal factors, which would be things like your resources, the experiences, general areas. So we talk about your human resources, your staff. If it is you have only 3 persons on staff and everybody else, as you get a project, then you would hire persons. Or if it is you look at volunteers, right? Board members that you have, the target population, if it is that you have a high turnover of staff, right? If you have a permanent staff, then that would be a strength. But if it is you always every week or every 2 weeks, 2 or 3 persons, or, as a contractor, and you all would understand as contractors, quite often you might not be able to rely on some workers, because the reality is that on a Friday evening or every fortnight, when some of them get paid, you might not see them for our next fortnight until all the money that they work for finished, right? And this is the reality that we are faced with. So, that might be a weakness. When you're talking about your physical resources, you talk about your location, if it is you have a permanent office, or if you're working out of your home, the building that you have, equipment. Do you have equipment, or are you just leasing equipment? And every time you have a job, you just have to lease the equipment. Either one, it would be either a strength or a weakness, right? Your building is in prime, your location is a prime location, meaning here, do I have to go out of the way? Do I have to really try and find your business, or is it that you are easily accessible within a specific area? Even when we're talking about financial, we're talking about the grants, the funding agencies, other sources of income, whereby we talk about if you're working for certain companies, they want to see you having 50% of the cost of the project in order for you to continue working. Some projects, they might ask you to start the project without receiving any amount as yet, any money as yet. In some projects right now, and especially I know some of you would work on government projects, they do ask to see your bank statement to see that if you are able to fund the project and then get paid, right? And these are, things that you have to consider. The activities and the processes you run. If it is that you have a stable team, a technically competent team, right? If you have a project management process team, a department whereby, the things that the methodologies that you would be using within your project are there and it's being implemented in your team. Then you could also have the past experiences. If you have zero past experience on a project, then obviously it would be a weakness. If you have experience on it, it would be a strength, right? And we would see now in the opportunities and the threats of the SWOT analysis, whereby we could look at those and we would see if it is that it would be an opportunity or a threat. And when we talk about opportunities and threats, we talk about things that really we cannot control, right? External things to the organization or to the project, right? Let's talk about, let's say, the future trends, right? Are you doing a project, or will a project be undertaken that would become obsolete in a few years? Then you might think, what is the sense of doing this project, right? And then I could actually tell you, with the impact of COVID-19, a lot of companies and organizations, they had to reevaluate projects that they were doing because they saw that the direction that COVID-19 started to send organizations and business on a whole, right? It started to change. So they had to reevaluate the way in which business was done. When we talk about the economy and funding sources and even demographics, right, and the physical environment, all these things going on in together, because the economy, if it is that at a specific time, and in Trinidad we could talk about this. Let's say you would have thought about in the construction field, and you would have priced projects that you would have been doing in 2019 to start in 2020. And when you price them, and in 2020 with COVID, the onset of COVID, and prices started to go up. Or then even so in 2020, you priced projects to start in 2021. And then, the cost of steel, of cement, of, raw materials, they started to go up as well. How, these are the things that you cannot control, and this is when we're talking about the economy, or even with funding sources. And I know I had actually a few friends who spoke about companies that they were working with, and they were going to start different projects. And then when the pandemic hit, the donors that they had, they then redirected their money to something else, which was COVID related, so that they no longer had to, although they did all this prep work for a project start, the project now had to be sidelined because of what was going on with the pandemic. And then even more so now, we could look at it when we talk about the demographic and the physical environment, about what's going on in Ukraine right now with the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, how it would affect importation in Trinidad and Tobago. If it is specific things were being imported from, let's say, even Russia, you have to consider now, and these are things that you cannot control. And this is why it needs to be considered when you are creating your SWOT analysis, right? Legislation, comes into effect, right? And even so, I could talk about legislation in the impact of COVID-19 with various restrictions of goods coming in, and especially if you're doing importation right now, you're looking at an increase in import duty. So all these things could be threats, or they could actually be opportunities for your organization to grow. So this is an example of a SWOT analysis of whether a company should have, chased, as it says, a government contract. And you could see from the strengths and weaknesses, the opportunities and the threats. This is how the layout of a SWOT analysis looks like. You identify the strengths, you identify the weaknesses, you identify the opportunities, and you identify the threats. And then after you'd have done this, then a team sits down and they look at, okay, do the strengths outweigh these weaknesses? Or even if the weaknesses outweigh the strengths, do the opportunities outweigh the weaknesses and the threats that we would get if it is we get this contract, right? Or do the opportunities outweigh the threats, right? Or is it that, quite often we hear about this 50-50. Is it a 50-50? Then you need to do more in-depth research, because you cannot undertake projects, every single project that is brought your way, because you would, if we go back to the first slide that we were talking about, you would undermine the quality of the work that is being done, and you would compromise your name and the name of the organization when you do work that is not up to a certain standard. And the reality is that many companies, they undertake work even though they are unable to, if they are not, they are unable and they are not equipped technically with the staff to competently handle the job. And this is why quite often you see, a job might start or a project might start, and then halfway through it might just get abandoned, because the persons who would have bid for it and they would have gotten it, then they realize halfway through it, we didn't know what we was doing, they overspend, they cross the budget, and then, they need to bring in someone else now in order to fix the project. And the company, sometimes they go under, all these different things could happen. So if you look at it, the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats, you and your team need to think now, okay, although we have these weaknesses identified, are these opportunities we would receive, right? Are they greater than the weaknesses and the threats? So usually we would want to do the conducting, and this is for your own edification for when you get a chance to conduct a SWOT analysis on a government project to construct a community center in Laborie. And, over time, if it is you look at your own company and, where you're working, you look at the strengths and you talk about the technical experience of your team. Is the location near or is it far? Are you financially capable to do something like this? Because remember I said with government projects, a lot of them now, they want to see that you are able to fund the project. Are you on call 24 hours? Do you have your own equipment? Do you have experienced personnel in this area? When I mean the area, not the location, but in this area of project management. Do you have if you have a functioning project department, the quality of work that you do, and if you also know injury time, and all these would be strengths. But when you look at it, sometimes the strength of one company could be also the weakness of another company. And, location, if we talk about Laborie, if it is you based in North or the East-West, then you have to consider transportation of your employees back and forth, where you're going to get employees from. If it is like we spoke about, you don't have dedicated workers. If a reality, and as well, this one, if you are not politically connected, you wouldn't be able to get these contracts. Human resource personnel, no technical experience, lack of resources, and even subcontracting. However, when persons were to look at the opportunities that they would have received from doing this project, they would look at the diversification of the company profile. You'd be able to market the company to show that, this is something that your company would have done, right? you make that political connection within the government. Therefore, you are able to receive other projects. It might not be big, it might continue to be bigger projects, smaller projects. The point is that you would make that connection there. Closer relationship with clients, and then your staff now would become trained in this project and this environment, and you would now become, let's say, technically competent in another area that you weren't in before. However, the threats that persons would have identified, such as strike action of workers, if you are a new contractor in the area, many times we see this, new contractors, they go into the area and they are quite often they're bullied and sabotaged, things will happen. You have to provide security for your workers, you have to provide security for the resources that are there. You have a lot of wastage of time, right? If it is, let's say the location is far, that commute every morning, right, for workers is a waste of time, right? There would be also the potential to lose clients because persons might think that you are not spending enough time on their projects because you've been awarded this big project now, or because of your political connections now that are made. When we talk about also with the competition of other contractors as well, and we talk about the environmental factors, we touched on it last week because these are things, the threats are always there. Who would have known for the last 3 to 4 days, so much rain would have been falling in the dry season in Trinidad, right? And you might have scheduled work that needed dry weather in order to be done, and for the last 4 days, you might not have been able to do anything. So what happens there? It's a threat to your schedule. Your schedule now, there's the threat that your schedule will go over the schedule. Other project selection methods that you could use would be like focusing on competitive strategy, performing an NPA, a weighted scoring, all these other, considering your project priority. If you have many projects and you really look at them, you really want to see if it's a priority. Another document that we create, actually one of the first documents that you create, is called the project charter. Many persons, it is very similar to what is known as a TOR, a terms of reference. So the project charter is a document that formally recognizes the existence of a project. What it does, it provides a summary of the project's objectives and the management of this project. And the project charter, why you might think, okay, I might not have seen this, right? Or you think that you did, you would have seen a TOR, yes, and it would have it. And it would recognize the existence of a project. Because if something recognizes the existence of it, then it's real. It's something that is legal. It's something that is legal. Because when you look at this, the components of the project charter, you see all these things here, from the top to the bottom, except the second to last one. All these things are normal within your project, right? But you see that sign off there? That sign off is what makes this document important, because you are able to sign off on the project, and you are able to, when you put your signature to a document, you're really putting, you're agreeing to it. And if you look at what you are agreeing to, you're agreeing to the schedule information, the start and finish dates, the budget information, the objectives. The objectives would be, at the end of this project, this is what I want to achieve, right? So if it is that something isn't in there, and how it is you're going to approach this project, what is it you're going to do? And if it is at the end of the project, you don't fulfill your project objectives, then your sponsor or the person who you are doing the project for, they have that right to, have some sort of litigation, right? That's why, the same way, if it is that you've completed your project and your sponsor doesn't want to do that final payment, you as well, you have that right to come back to this and say, well, I fulfilled all these objectives and I fulfilled it within the time and within budget, and you are not doing it, then you as a project manager, you have that right to undergo some form of litigation for them as well, against them, because you would have fulfilled your part of this because of the sign off that you have here. Benefits of these things, you could really read on it, right? And another part that is important would be portfolios. According to PMI, a portfolio is a collection of projects or programs and other work that are grouped together to facilitate effective management of that work, right? And when we say they're grouping work together, it's really you're creating a portfolio of projects, right? So when we're talking about portfolio management, and there is something called project portfolio management or project portfolio manager, whereby the project portfolio manager manages many projects at a time, right? According to the portfolio that they have. And we might ask ourselves, okay, so how is it then that we might group projects together? If you're working in an organization, if you're working in a company or institution, what criteria could be used in order for us to group these projects together, right? And we're thinking, to create a portfolio. And this is it here. You could group your projects according to the size of the project. You might look at, large projects as opposed to smaller projects. You would also look at the type of project that there is, right? You would have project managers. So you'd have one who would see about all the construction projects, one next project manager that might see about all the engineering projects, and that's how you could look at it based on the type of project. The duration of projects, you might have someone who you might now be training to take over from a senior project manager, and they might give them the shorter span projects, or and they give the more senior project manager the longer projects. Or it could be opposite, because the shorter projects, sometimes they might more be technically competent, and they might be on a crunch time, and somebody with experience might be able to finish it because it's within that time space. Cost, I have seen companies do this, whereby projects between 500,000 to 1 million, and then 1 million to 2 million. No, sorry, 1 million to 5 million, and then 5 million and over. So they had 3 different project managers managing these the projects based on the cost. Resources, the different types of resources that you have, and the personnel you have based on the location. The project manager in South and a project manager in North. They see about all, you have one for Tobago and all, right? Then even on the sponsors, your government sponsors, your private sponsors, the type of product that you would be producing, as well as your priority. And you see, I noticed I put the traffic light there, because we often want to prioritize, and I mentioned it earlier, all our projects. And you want to prioritize them for those that are high priority, that need to be red listed, right? Those that are intermediate, that might not be, it needs to get done, but it's not urgently needed, but it has to get done, right? And you would amber list those. And then on the green, those that are there and you really want to eventually get to them. It's not urgent. It doesn't have to get done. And I can tell you one experience, that this is something that I did when I went into an organization, because they didn't have any sort of project management. And they always, all these different projects we have, and we need to, and I said, okay, one day in a toolbox meeting, a team meeting we had, and I said, let's list out all. So we listed out all the projects that we had to do. And after then, because everybody, or each department now would want to say, oh, all our projects are priorities, high priority. And we listed it out so everybody could have seen. And then we started to say, okay, which ones would be high priority, which would be intermediate. So it's red light, the amber, and then the green. And you list out your projects according to their priority, right? And these are different ways in which you could implement project portfolio management. So what we have now, listening to me for the last however long, tends to become a bit boring, don't you see? So what I'm going to do now, we have someone else, another expert within the field. We're going to be talking about another very important document, which is the project management plan. So we listen in and then we talk about it after. It's 2 short videos. Let me just share sound so that you could hear, share sound, right? All right, so let's listen in.
Hello, I'm Dave Litton from Project Management Primer, and a very warm welcome to this short project management plan video. Now, I'm sure you've heard the old saying, those who fail to plan to fail, and that's absolutely true. Without a plan, the project is just a leap of faith. So the project management plan itself will be created by the project manager, and it will consist of a series of documents. And inside the project management plan, it will clearly state why the project is needed, what the project is to cover, its scope if you will, how it's going to be done, and how much in terms of time and costs, who's involved, who's responsible for what, when things should occur, and where they will be created. So the documents that come together to make the project management plan, there are other plans which we'll look at in a moment, but the purpose of the PMP is to document the project outcomes. Now, a project delivers deliverables, sometimes called products. These are the specialist or technical outcomes. For example, if you are building a house, then that would be the end product. The outcome is as a result of the change. In other words, we now live in a new house. And it is the reference document for managing the project. The important thing to remember here is that the project management plan is a living document. Yes, it's created at the beginning and signed off in some way, and it's then under what we call baseline control. In other words, it's a reference point against which the project manager manages, monitors, controls and reports. Now, the project management plan is created in the so-called definition phase. This is where it's created and signed off by the sponsor or project board and hence baselined. During implementation, that's the delivery phase if you will, the project management plan is monitored, managed and controlled and updated as required. Let's just discuss briefly the so-called project management processes. At some point, a phase, a stage or a project is started and it's agreed to initiate work. There then normally follows a sequence where the plan is created, it's monitored, where progress, actual progress against what was planned to happen is measured, and as is most likely the case when things don't go exactly to plan, it's controlled. This means correcting small deviations. And then of course as a result of that the plan needs to be updated, and this is where we learn from experience and modify the plan, and the cycle continues. Eventually, of course, you come to the end of a project or a phase or a stage and it's closed. The project life cycle can be explained in many ways, and this is one of the most often used. The first phase is the concept phase. This is where it's understood what the terms of reference and what the business case looks like, and then from that point, once that information is put before the sponsor or project board, we move to the next phase. And this is called the definition phase. This is where, as you'll see, the project management plan is created. And at the end of that phase in time, it would be signed off and baselined. Then we're into the implementation phase, in which case this may be split into several stages. And again, here's the cyclical arrangement which I just showed you. But when the project gets to the end of the last phase, then we need to hand over and close out. This is where the end products or end deliverables, the outcomes if you remember, are handed over to the customer or users, and the project is shut down in a controlled manner. This should give you a good understanding of a phased delivery of a typical project. So it's in the definition phase where the project management plan is created, and it's in the implementation phase and all stages where the project management plan is updated on a regular basis. So let's now look at the contents of a project management plan. The why of why we need to do the project is answered in the business case, which contains the benefits, and it also contains information such as the aggregated risks and the costs and timescales. So the business case should be viable. The next section in a project management plan is called the what, and here you'd lay down the objectives for the project. The what contains the scope of the project. Another word for scope is what's included and what isn't. And here, of course, are the deliverables or products. At the end of the project, the acceptance criteria, created here in the project management plan and agreed, is used to pass over the end product or end deliverable to the customer, and they would accept it against this criteria. Something called the project success criteria. These are particular criterion which are laid down against which the project must meet or not be successful, of course. KPIs, or key performance indicators, are measurement points towards each success criteria. Constraints are what the project plan must work within. Typically this might be time, cost, quality, and so on and so forth. Any assumptions that are being made, so they're documented here so they can be used and tested as the project goes through its various phases. And dependencies, these may be individuals or actions, perhaps external to your organisation as well as the project. How much states, of course, the budget. Of course, the project budget may just be a single figure, but you might have cash flow where you're getting funding from other sources, in which case often called a spend plan. Here you can show, for example, management how much you should have spent by a particular time against what you actually spent. And you'll have some form of cost management process. I don't need to go into this here. It will vary greatly depending on your company and your industry. How? These are strategies, how you intend to monitor, control and report against the project. Quality management, how you are going to meet the fitness for purpose criteria. Communication, how that is to happen. Who are your stakeholders? How often you're going to communicate with them, and so on and so forth. And configuration management, which may be seen as version control, if you will, and how changes are to be controlled. How the project is to be managed and governed. This will normally include key stakeholders, such as the project manager, of course, and sponsors or project board or steering group. Depending on the nature of the project, you may need to include health, safety, and the environment aspects in it. And if the project is of that type, you may have a lot of procurement, perhaps with your legal department, purchasing and supplies and so on, and how such items are to be handed over at key points. And of course, how are you going to manage risks? The when is the project schedule or time frame. This would normally be represented as a Gantt chart or something similar. Who, this of course is the project roles, who's responsible for what, and a resource plan showing what resources you need and when. For example, in a given week or a month, you may show how many engineers you want, and so on and so forth. And don't forget, resource plans cover non-human resources as well as folks like you and I. Where these are geographical locations where the work will be performed. It may be within your company or organisation, or you may well have third parties, possibly in other countries. So let's talk about the project management plan, authorship, readership and ownership. Don't forget the project manager is responsible for creating the project plan, but the whole team will make a contribution towards it. The stakeholders, who are they? Of course, they'll include stakeholders inside the project management team, but they may be third parties and other users and customers. I'm sure there will be. It's owned by the project manager. It's formally accepted by the project sponsor or the project board or a steering group, whichever phrase that you would normally use on behalf of your organisation. It's formally accepted by the project manager on behalf of the team, because of course the project manager will use it to give out the work. And as I've said here, it forms the basis for the management and control of the project and assessment of its overall success as it goes through each of its phases and ultimately at the end of the project. Well, thank you for your company. That brings us to the end of the Project Management Plan Part 1. Hi, this is Dave Litton, and welcome back to part 2 of the project management plan. In this session, we're going to look at the approach you need to planning in order to create the project management plan itself. So let's start off with what's known as the project scope definition. Now, the word scope is quite an important phrase you need to understand. It's what's included and what isn't. And one of the biggest dangers with projects is that when we get to the end of the project, the customers and users have a different expectation of what they were going to get. So it's important before we get anywhere near producing a plan, we need to understand what the project scope is. The first step is actually to produce an outline project business case and later refine it. Now, the business case will actually contain what the expected benefits are of the project. Remember, the project produces deliverables, or another word for that is products. A deliverable is anything the project delivers, a product is anything the project produces. So they're both the same thing. However, a product on its own isn't of any use. It's only of any use if this product, over a period of time, will realize benefits to the organization and hence the business. So the business case will contain the benefits expected, what risks there are. Remember, a business case is like a set of scales. We need to look at benefits on one side and balance that against, amongst other things, costs and risks. The project and operational timescales and costs. We would actually extract this information from the project management plan. The reason why this is important is that knowing how long the project will take to deliver will determine the earliest possible time, usually, when benefits can be realized and hence some return on the investment. And the budget needed to fund the project is also important, as well as costs in the operational life. So some of these will come from the project plan and some of these will come from the operational part of the organization. However, they need to be built into the business case, and normally some form of investment appraisal will be carried out. Don't worry if you're not familiar with this term. It's normally just a financial metric to ensure that the business case represents value for money. So we'll start off with an outline business case, and that'll be refined as the project goes through its phases, and from this we'll produce the project plan. After all, the project plan states how and when and who and what have you you're going to do to realize ultimately the benefits in the business case. But normally projects are split down into stages or phases, and in which case you may have several phases or stages, and you would take the project plan and break it down into stage plan levels. When you give out work to the specialist or technical teams, depending on the nature of the project, then they may well optionally have their own team level plan. The purpose of this slide is merely to show you that in a typical project, apart from the very smallest, you may have different levels of plans for different purposes. As part of determining what the scope of a project is, you would normally, as part of planning, produce some form of breakdown structures. Now, there's many of them, but the most obvious that you've probably come across might look something like this. And I've just come up with an example here of designing a website. So this will be the ultimate end product, if you will, the website itself, and you would split it down into product parts or deliverable parts. So these are the things that all need to be done as part of marketing. These are all the images that need to be created, and here's the sales page and text on the website. So this is a high level, and we'd split this down further to the packages of work, the activities, if you will, to create all of the products that are needed as part of the sales page. And it's called a breakdown structure because it's a hierarchy, and the human brain quite likes the way that this is created. You'll find that if you put your team in a room, perhaps using post-it notes, you can generate this type of layout quite quickly. The other thing you might want to do is to do a similar breakdown structure in terms of the organization. This might be Department A, Department B, this might be a third party, and so on and so forth. It's a nice way of getting clear in the planning meeting exactly who needs to be involved. The other type of view which would be useful is taking each of these activities and thinking about producing costs. You might do it by cost center, or again you might do it by marketing costs, graphic costs and sales page costs. The beauty of this is that as you add each lower level up, It shows you what the next level is and so on, and you can determine the budget for the whole of the project. So early on in planning, having scoped it, and as part of understanding exactly what the scope is, you would want to use some form of breakdown structures. Soon after that, you would want to think about the activities and put them in some form of sequence. The correct name for this is a network diagram. Folks in America might often call this a precedence diagram. Sometimes people mistakenly call it a PERT chart. That's not quite right, but you may come across that term. And don't worry too much about this here. These are merely activities with the arrows showing the sequence in which they need to be created. You can see that some of the activities occur after each other and others can happen in parallel. Again, this will be brainstormed in your planning meeting. The purpose here is if you determine each duration of each activity, you can do something called critical path analysis, and you can end up with the end date. In other words, this is the earliest point when your project could be finished based on the activities and their duration and their relationships and dependencies. Another way of representing this is via what's known as a Gantt chart, and you may hear the term scheduling. This could equally apply to the previous slide. And a Gantt chart shows the activities, and I've just done them as a very simple sequence here, one after the other, where the duration of each activity is shown against a bar, against a time frame. So this might be calibrated in weeks, months, and so on and so forth. And here again would be the end date. Now, if you looked at a real one of these in detail, you'd find little links like this showing logical dependencies. Unlike this simple diagram here, you would normally find that each task or activity would have link lines showing the logical dependencies. Much like the previous diagram showed you the arrows here and how each of the activities relate to each other. However, the next thing to consider is, having thought about the activities, what about resources? It's one thing having a load of tasks and you know when each should start and finish, but it's another thing altogether about getting the work done. Now, the normal way of carrying out resource management, and you may have to negotiate with a resource manager, it's unlikely that you would own the people themselves, and you need to identify what resources are required and assign them in some way to your activities. You need to make sure the resources are appropriate for the tasks or activities. What this means is that if they're human, do they have sufficient knowledge, skills and experience? In the real world, of course, we don't always have everything that we want, and we need to consider resource constraints. You may well find that your plan shows you need, let's say, 3 engineers in week 10. Speaking to the resource manager, you may not find you've got that many available, or indeed, you may not have that many working in your organization, and you may have to go and hire them, or adjust your time frame to make do with the amount of resources you could actually get. Now, as I touched on just now, resources come in a variety of different forms. We've talked about people, of course, like you and I, but there may be materials that you need. Materials normally get consumed in carrying out a task or activity. You may need special equipment or facilities such as setup bays, training rooms and so on. And you'll certainly need money, of course. That's the budget of the project. Accommodation is another type of resource you may need depending on the nature of the project. Machinery or special services or goods that you need to purchase. Any special tools needed in carrying out the activities and so on. So I hope this slide is opening your mind to it's not just people you need, but a variety of other resources that all need to be assigned and appointed to particular activities, so that the plan is realistic, both in terms of time frame, but also in terms of the resources required. So that when management sign off the project management plan, it's got everything in it needed to make the project a success. Just going back to that little cartoon, if you will, of a Gantt chart showing these activities, you can imagine that, let's say this is 1 week in duration, and if I was working on that, you might find that my internal labour rate might cost you, let's say, £1,000, in which case after 1 week the project would have spent £1,000. So if you now plot this on a cumulative cost graph, let's imagine this is 1 week here, you can look up here and see that this would be £1,000 on this vertical scale. If you continued, you'd have what's known as an S-curve, Although this doesn't look much like an S, traditionally projects start off and spend little at the beginning of the project. When you get into design, development and testing, the costs ramp up quite a lot because there's lots of people doing lots of work, and then they tail off towards the end. So it would look like a very shallow S. And here, of course, this is helpful in you managing and monitoring the project, because if this was today's date here, let's imagine, you could follow the planned spend and look across and say, by this period of time, we should have spent this much money. And if it's different to what the plan says, then you need to take some corrective action. Again, can I remind you that going back to breakdown structures, do you remember we looked at cost breakdown structures? Here's a simple example showing again how you might split a project up into labour, materials, equipment and overheads. This giving you the total budget. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the second step. Thank you again.
So now that we've listened to everything there, and one of the main things is that, yeah, we listened to it. However, all of the information that was given in those videos, they're actually within the slides as well. If you look in the introduction here, you have what the project management plan is. It talks about the different aspects of the project management plan, right? And then gives you the structure of the plan. So everything that was covered there, it just went into a bit more detail. We have it here as well. The benefits of it, whereby they spoke about, he spoke about convincing investors and, defining the market that you have, right? And even talking about the value for your project, or, as we spoke earlier today, in case there's some sort of litigation, if the sponsor is unable to pay you for the project, setting a value for the project that has been completed. He spoke about the why, the what, the who, as well as the when. I think he also had the how in there, and then it also gives you the overview of what the plan covers, okay? And like I said, one of the reasons is just to, give you a different perspective from someone else on the project management plan. So with that in mind, I'll come into something here now that is, I know everyone is quite excited about. So part of your assessment, you have to do a presentation. So the presentation would entail, you have to find an example of a project with a project manager. It could be you or somebody else, or a project that you've worked on. I would always ask for a project from where you're working presently, because when you present it, we are able to talk about is a real life scenario, it's a real experience, okay? Not to go on it, because I had students in the past and they went and they Googled a project and then they came and they give and it was so, I don't want to use the word ridiculous, but it was really out of their scope, because the scope of the project that they chose was so huge. I've had persons who have come and, do something quite simple and they've received full marks, something as simple as setting up a business or opening a car wash, things like that. Things very, very simple, construction of a box drain, of a dog house, all these things, that's, I always like to say, try to keep things simple. When you make it simple, you would understand it better. So you'll be writing points, describing the project in terms of the scope, the time, the cost, and quality, which we spoke about this morning, those 4 things. The lessons learned on the project. When we talk about lessons learned, we talk about what things went right, what things went wrong. We talk about, what you have learned and you would keep with you and take with you if it is you ever do a similar project. You might want to talk about if the project manager fulfilled his or her role during the project. And then also describe whether you consider the project to be a success or failure, and then you have to say why or why not. Because sometimes you might complete, a lot of persons they have a misconception that if a project is completed, that means it was a success. However, a lot of projects are completed, but they are not deemed as a success, right? Because let's say you complete a project that was supposed to take 2 years, and you take 5 years to complete it, and it's over the budget. Oh wait, we do have an example. The Brian Lara Stadium. Okay, no, I'll just scratch that, right? But you know, you take projects and they completed, and you really want to know, well, how is it deemed a success, right? So this is a presentation. There's no written. When I say write points, I mean this is for your notes, but you don't have to hand in anything specifically to me. You would be evaluated based on your presentation skills, as well as, you know, your ability to answer the project management questions. And I'm going to ask technical competency questions about, you know, the PSI or the strength of the concrete used, and, you know, things like that. No. All right. So this is the presentation. It's not due for next week. It's due for week 4. I think ideas. Oh, right. Suggested outline to answer the question. You give a brief overview of the project. You talk about the scope, what were the main deliverables or the work packages that you had to do. The time, the costing, the quality, the standards used to govern the acceptance of the project, right? Or what quality standards do you use within your work? What were the lessons learned, and the other 2 pieces there. So I would open it up now for any questions.
Good morning. Kevin
Morning.
Trotman here.
Yeah.
Sorry for being late. What happened now? My wife did a little procedure yesterday, so kind of took up my time this morning preparing for her.
Right.
Right. So I didn't really grasp the full
Well, it's recorded, thankfully. When I saw you weren't here, I recorded it. So I'll send the recording after.
Okay, great. Appreciate it. Right. So I just let you know the reason for being late now.
All right, no problem.
Right, okay.
All right, so I feel we have no questions then. Right, and because we have no questions, let me get my stop share. Right, good. So let me pause.